We know this country thrives off of oppression. We know that it thrives off of marginalizing others. But how exactly did governments take advantage of predominantly Black and brown communities in the United States of America through roads? My next guest is journalist Megan Kimble, whose book City Limits we go over, and who you should absolutely be following and also purchasing her book, because it is fascinating and also a huge letdown to know that this has been in motion for a long time. Before we get to Megan Kimble, if you have enjoyed watching this, please subscribe on YouTube. If you have enjoyed listening to it, please give me a 5-star rating and leave a comment on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Without further ado, here is Megan Kimble. All right, what's up, y'all? Welcome back, and I have another very special guest for everybody. This is Megan Kimble, the author of City Limits, Infrastructure, Inequality, and the Future of America's Highways. She is an awesome journalist. She has written for the New York Times, the Texas Observer, to name a few. Megan, I told you before we came on, I loved your book, but it made me really mad. And it explains so much about the United States of America. So, to start, thank you for joining me, first off. So, to start, Robert Moses is a name that you went over. You also discussed lobbying in the beginning of the book, and you wrote about how transit companies simply could not compete. Here is my question. Why is transit, which has shown to be such an effective way for us to get around, just been stifled, whether it is through bills, whether it's through politicians? Why is transit always on the short end of the stick?
Oh, yeah, that's such a great question. I mean, when I started reporting this book back in 2020, I had started covering a massive highway expansion in Houston called the North Houston Highway Improvement Project. And that will add capacity to this massive highway right through the middle of town. And I remember asking, like, very early on as I was doing interviews, TxDOT has sold this project as a way to fix congestion. Houston is booming. More people are moving there. We need to expand this highway to fix congestion. And I remember being like, well, why don't they just add a bus lane? Why don't they just add a bus rapid transit lane? That seems like the most effective way to fix congestion. Mm-hmm. And that seems like such a simple question. And I remember some of the advocates I was talking to were kind of like, like, it's actually it's a simple question to ask and pretty complicated to answer. And like the shortest version I have come to, which took me several years to report as I was working on my book, is like, I think the simplest explanation is Americans have been sold on the idea of cars as prosperity and freedom. So this started in the 1940s with the rise of, the automobile of Ford and General Motors, massive advertising campaigns to sell those cars to American consumers. Americans bought them in droves, in part because they were pretty miraculous. This improvement in technology allowed people to move around untethered from a trolley line. Like they could go where they wanted to go when they wanted to go. And planners and kind of the American sort of infrastructure establishment followed suit. We dedicated billions and billions of dollars to building roads to accommodate all of these cars that were pouring off mass factory lines. And as a result, we have the cities that we have today, where most cities in America are just covered in concrete, covered in highways, covered in massive roads. And within that framework, it's sort of hard to understand, how could transit ever work? And where I live is Austin. It's really hard to take the bus anywhere. We don't have a very functional transit system, in part because our city is very sprawling. It came up around the car. But that very much was a policy choice in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And a lot of what I do in my book is chronicle the fight around the interstate highway era with President Eisenhower in 1956. Eisenhower's intention for the interstate highway program was not to build massive highways right through the middle of our cities. It was to connect the country. It was to connect Houston to Dallas and New York to Los Angeles. But instead, what planners did is they built highways right through the middle of the city. And in the process, they destroyed a lot of transit systems. So what today seems kind of like this inevitable outcome that it's, in most American cities, we don't have transit. The number of people I hear talking in Texas, well, we don't have transit now, so we can't build it. Well, that was a choice that we made 70 years ago, and we could make it again today.
Right. We could make it again. We could also just try to develop means for a greater good And also, I noticed, you said it and I caught on to it. This being the theme of freedom. Like, first off, that term is thrown around like crazy these days, especially with Americans, even though we are losing our rights left and right. But when it comes to American freedom, why is it so tethered and associated? It seems intrinsically linked to a car.
It's a great question, and one that, like, again, is so cultural. It's not really like, it does not stand to reason. Lots of other countries have wonderful transit systems, and people there report higher quality of lives, that they spend less of their disposable income on transportation. The air quality is better. They have fewer greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector. So, like, why are Americans so stubbornly kind of stuck on cars? And I think it's like two things. Is one is like, well, our political leaders have only built cities in which it is most convenient to get around in a car. So like it's very hard to imagine, or even in fact, like not even imagine, exist outside of a car in most American cities. If you don't have one, you don't have the same access to opportunity. So, like, indeed, it's true that because of infrastructure decisions that we made 70 years ago, like, you are more free in most American cities if you have a car. But, like, I think what is tricky about that is, like, lots of places around the world have shown that you can actually change that policy decision. There are lots of European cities, Copenhagen, Paris, that have said, hey, we don't want this many cars in our city. We want to give people other options, and we're going to dedicate infrastructure funding to create those options, to build really robust transit. I mean, Mexico City is a great example. They had crushing air pollution, traffic goes gridlocked, and they built like an amazing world-class bus rapid transit system, and you can get a bus at Mexico City like almost every 3 minutes.
Oh,
So it is
wow.
absolutely possible to retrofit a car-centric city. We just are sort of choosing not to, and that like reinforces the idea that to get anywhere worth going to, you need a car.
I'm going to get into a few of the numbers in a second. You saying Mexico City is ironic because I'm going there for the first time in a few months. Secondly, I think about how I live in Chicago, but I lived in LA on and off for 10 years. Very different ways of addressing this, where Chicago has the L, they have the Metro. Buses are very dependable even in the snow. And in LA, everyone tries to avoid the bus like the plague. When I look at Los Angeles, I know you said, this is 70 some years ago. I remember reading up that there were a ton of trains available back in the day in LA, and it just got decimated by the automobile industry. What will it take to go back to Americans and freedom? What will it take for American citizens to go with plans of mass transit, public way, like public goods, essentially, to improve their lives and also improve the lives of others, even though historically now they think the only way to get around is a car? Like what would it take to change hearts and minds, Megan?
I mean, I think what it takes is like riding good transit and realizing in a place that has really good transit, like how much you have access to and how like the ease of access and the affordability of that access. So for a lot of people, it takes visiting a city with really good transit, which I know I understand it's not available to every American. But I think like I said, it's hard to live in a city like Austin and really kind of imagine how your life might transform with good transit. And then it's worth saying like the other thing is like, again, I keep harping on the money because like I think we do not fund transit. And so to really get people to change their minds around what could a city that has robust transit look like we need to fund it like we want people to ride it. So that means, excuse me, sorry.
You're good.
That means, so in the every 7 years, Congress passes a surface transportation reauthorization. And since 1982, since the Ronald Reagan administration, we have spent 80 cents of every dollars on road and 20 cents on transit. Every time that surface transportation reauthorization comes up, there's always people in Congress who say, hey, maybe we should spend a little bit more of federal money on transit systems. Maybe it should be 50-50. If that changed, that would be transformative. Most transit operators use local revenue to fund their operations, which means they just don't have a lot of money to build good transit that people can ride. And like the difference, as you've experienced in Chicago versus Los Angeles, like a bus or a train that comes every 5 or 10 minutes versus one that comes every 30 is
Hmm.
like an absolute world of difference. And like you don't change minds until you have a bus that comes every 5 minutes and people realize they can rely on it to get where they need to go.
Amen to that. A few of the numbers that you went over in your book, according to the American Public Transit Association, excuse me, there were 17.2 billion passenger rides nationally in 1950. By 1960, it was 9.4 billion. That is the automobile industry in full effect. Another one that just stuck out to me, with few exceptions adjusted for inflation, federal spending on public transportation has remained essentially flat since 1982, as you went over. The gas tax has since doubled to 18.4 cents a gallon, but the ratio agreed upon, a political deal for a tax increase that has long since become obsolete, has remained. Highway programs receive 80% of federal transportation funding, while transit gets only 20%. So I know that you said, not to harp on money. It is totally about the money. It is. And even later on, I was going to bring this up later, but, the Biden administration, depending on how you really looked into the bill and how it was framed, I saw a lot of libs being like, oh, this is so amazing. But then I saw others who were saying, well, wait a minute. This money is going to highways. It's not really helping out anybody. So it feels like withstanding the test of time is politicians, whether it is the lobbying efforts from the automobile industry or not, that they will by default go and benefit the car more than they will transit. Does that seem to be the theme for you?
Yeah, and then there's a funny political narrative that I have seen a lot in Texas. I've seen it nationally, and there is this notion somehow that highways are self-sustaining, that they represent, I've heard people describe road infrastructure as good free market capitalism. They enable our economies to boom. They let us get to our jobs, they allow job creation. I mean, the governor of Texas has said everything we're doing for infrastructure is keeping us number one in the nation for economic development. But like highways are massively subsidized.
Mm-hmm.
The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act allocated about $500 billion to highway programs across the country. And yet we think that transit needs to be self-sustaining. And there's a narrative around transit is that it's government subsidized transportation. And that is just patently false when you look at how we spend our money. Our roads are heavily subsidized, but there is this sort of very persistent narrative that they're not, that they are paid for by the gas tax, which again is not true. If you look at gas tax receipts, they do not fill up the highway trust fund. And so I think that is something also that you have to counter is that in an era when government does not want to be seen as subsidizing a public good necessarily, we are subsidizing roads. And actually we could, again, make different subsidy decisions based on outcomes.
Could you call roads socialist, Megan?
I don't know. I've heard people call transit socialist, so I don't think it's like they're both socialist, right? It's both a massive government infrastructure program. Like, what
Right.
is the infrastructure we want? That's the more important question.
Absolutely. I think you could somehow call roads racist as well. You went over, and these are just heartbreaking stories about I-45, Houston's Fifth Ward. At one point in your book, you said families were given 6 months to find housing. It was 1959, almost a decade before, that's important, the Fair Housing Act would open up neighborhoods to non-white families. You also went with, you mentioned Eric Avila, who's a professor at UCLA, who claimed between 1956 and 66, highway construction would crush 37,000 plus units of housing each year. The Department of Transportation would estimate more than 1 million people were forced from their homes. City planners labeled them slums. No way of fighting back. By 1965, the Voting Rights Act, of course, most urban highways were planned and built. This was devastating to hear the stories from not just the Fifth Ward, but there were many others as well. But it's not even just homes. It was homes, yes, which is devastating, but it was the livelihood of people and where they went and how they just took in life. So as you were researching this, was there, and obviously you talked to a ton of people as well, daycares, etc. Was there one story that just stuck out to you in all of this?
Yeah, I mean, historically speaking, I think the one that resonated most with me was in Houston's Fifth Ward. The Interstate 10, it's this historically Black community settled by freed slaves. And Interstate 10 tore right through the middle of that community in the late 1950s and took out 2 city blocks, right in the heart of a community where everybody walked, everybody knew each other. There was, schools that all the kids went to. It was a very like complete community that everything was there that they needed. And I talked to this one woman who was in middle school. Her name's Oneri Goodry, when the highway came through. And she was sort of too young to understand what was really happening, but she remembers coming home from school and seeing her parents incredibly upset because they had just gotten a letter in the mail from the Texas Highway Department saying, "Hey, we need the land that your house is on." And she recalls, she and her ex-husband, I talked to both of them, recalled, how quickly the neighborhood around them just transformed. They would go to school and then a house would be gone on their block, that it was like moved somewhere else or was demolished. These giant soaring trees that shaded the neighborhood, overnight they would be felled. I talked to this one woman who lived near Oneri who said in the middle of the night she woke up and there was like a house sort of floating down her street and she had no idea where it had come from and then ended up in her backyard. And I just think that like speaks to the fact that like these Black communities were not given agency or participation in any of these projects. Highways happened to Black communities. They very much harmed them, but like people had no idea what was happening, even as they had to leave their homes, communities were uprooted. And the thing that really stuck with me is that Oneri really wanted to, this first woman I spoke of, she really wanted to graduate from Phyllis Wheatley High School, which is a very prominent Black high school in Houston. And her family had moved, I think, something like 3 miles away from the high school. And so she and a sort of gang of kids who had also moved to this displaced neighborhood called Kashmere Gardens walked every day back to school. So they walked 7 miles round trip school and back because they were so determined to stay connected to the community that they had grown up on, despite that highway just absolutely ripping it in half.
What really gets me as well was Ms. Anna Herndon, who would tell the Dallas Express, a Black-owned newspaper, every time and she uses the N-word, which was also a name for the old baseball leagues, gets a place that is decent, the white man finds some use for it. 1,300 plus homes were demolished for the South Central Expressway. What I think would be really beneficial is to understand and maybe for you to explain why they had no agency and why did Texas do this, not just willingly, but being able to destroy people's lives legally.
Yeah, it's worth saying at the outset, it was not just Texas that did this. Every single state in the union did this.
Yes.
But so I think we have to go back to like late 1930s and the Homeowners Loan Corporation that redlined a lot of Black and Hispanic neighborhoods across the U.S. because they simply deemed that, families of color were less creditworthy, that were or a less reliable loan for as the federal government was backing mortgages. So HOLC appraisers, redlined neighborhoods across the U.S., including Houston's Fifth Ward. And so a lot of these Black neighborhoods, Hispanic neighborhoods, immigrant neighborhoods were denied access to credit, and they became sort of impoverished as a result of lending decisions made by the federal government. 2 decades later, the federal government passes the Interstate Highway Act, and suddenly states have tons of money to build interstate highways. And there was a very, explicit realization that money could solve 2 problems at once, which is to get rid of the quote unquote local in town, which is a direct quote from one of the directors of the highway program.
Insane.
And build these highways. So, they wanted to, this is the era of urban renewal. We want to get rid of quote unquote blight. So we're going to go ahead and come through these neighborhoods that we don't want to exist anyway. And we're going to, hey, we have all this money to build highways. Like what an opportunity for us to do both goals at once. And so that is very much written in the historic record that planners saw an opportunity to use federal highway funding to get rid of these blighted neighborhoods. That was government policy. I found a report that was a few years old. A researcher today looked at red line neighborhoods and found that they were 3 times as likely to have a highway routed through them as the best rated neighborhoods. So, this is the legacy of discrimination by the federal government, documented by lots of other journalists and historians. But what the federal highway program did is just made that, there was money to clear these neighborhoods. And so people did not have the ability to resist. Again, the Voting Rights Act had not passed. People could not vote these representatives out of office. And so, they just were told what was happening.
You also told the story about Elm Street, which was the heart of downtown, known as Deep Ellum. And you give some numbers that also really stuck out to me. By 1965, the block had begun to empty out. By 75, the year after the highway opened, addresses on that block of Elm Street were listed as vacant. The highway consumed a total of 54 city blocks. What was this, if you could paint the picture for the audience, what was this area like before it was just completely decimated by a highway?
Yeah, so this is a neighborhood to the east of downtown Dallas. It's called Deep Ellum, and it was kind of a business district. It was very integrated. It was one of the only places in Dallas that were integrated, that Black people and immigrants and white people all kind of mixed together. There were lots of businesses. It wasn't very residential. It was a business district, but it was very, a thriving, populated area. Everybody walked to do their commerce. I talked to a couple of business owners who remember it just being this like, as close to New York as you were going to get in downtown Dallas,
Mm.
just people on the streets. And you can see there's lots of great photos in the historic archives of what that looked like. You can see people walking down the street in these businesses, these tea rooms, parlors, repair shops, you name it. Um, and in the late 1950s, the Texas Department of Transportation, then the Texas Highway Department, decided to build a highway right through the middle of that neighborhood, and really took out, like I document, on one, I can't actually remember the number in the book, but on one city block, it was dozens of businesses. And it was wild as just a journalist to go through old city directories, and you can just see them disappear off the pages. Like, you can just see decade to decade to decade, every 5 years as they publish a new city directory, like how much was lost in this one district of Dallas for this highway.
I think I might have that number. Was it in 1950, 29 businesses occupied that block?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so there's another one that also stands out to me. It's a quote, rather. I just had it from Jamie Cano, who said, of folks being displaced, that sense of instability that people feel, especially when they had no idea. As in, you are told, as you outlined, that you have to leave, and then you pretty much have to pack up, take whatever is given to you, which is peanuts, and then try to find another life. One person who opened a daycare, Escuelita de Alma, in 2000 was Dina Flores. What is her story in this book?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because it's like a lot of these stories of displacement from the 1950s and 60s may seem like something like, oh, we did that in the past. Surely we have learned from them. And as a matter of fact, we have not. We are doing the exact same thing today in Texas and cities across the country. As we expand highways, we are continuing to displace people and businesses. So the example of Dina Flores is one that like really, tugged my heartstrings as I was reporting it. But she started this bilingual daycare called Escuelita de Alma right in downtown Austin in the 2000s to serve, a lot of the office workers downtown. A few years after she had started, had this like thriving daycare, bilingual preschool. She found out that the building they were in was getting sold to a developer. Downtown Austin is booming, it's transforming. The site that they were in was going to become a hotel. So she said, uh-oh, I got to go find a new place to house my school. I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this. And the community really rallied around Escuelita. It was this beloved kind of local institution. A lot of city council members sent their kids there. People in the legislature sent their kids there. And they ended up finding this building right on the I-35 frontage road. It actually belonged to Richard Linklater, the famous movie director. So I got one celebrity in my highway book. Um, and she was able to connect with him through this, stroke of luck and get him to lease her this building. And she got it at a very affordable rate. And so this preschool has been in this building since, 2006, I think. They've grown. They, lease the building next door now. They have about 200 families who send their kids there to preschool. It's very centrally located. UT, University of Texas is nearby. There's a hospital. So there's a big market of parents who need childcare nearby. And one day in 2021, Dina got a letter from the Texas Department of Transportation saying, hey, we're going to expand I-35, which runs right in front of the school, and we're going to need you to move. And her heart sank. Like she had already been through the process of moving a preschool. I think like what was so sort of moving to me about a preschool, it's like, a person, a family moving their home is obviously enormous for that family. A business moving is enormous for that business owner, but like a preschool contains the lives of 200 families, right? That pick up and drop off, like this sort of geography of a day of juggling childcare for working parents is like incredibly integral to their success. And suddenly this preschool like did not know if they were going to survive. Like rents in Austin are incredibly high. They didn't know if they were going to find a place to move that would fit all the requirements that are needed for a preschool. And so for a couple of years when I was reporting the book, like they really were in this limbo of we don't know if we can keep Esquilita open. And I went and spent a day in the preschool and it was just like, kids are cute. Kids have moral authority. Um, and it just was so moving to me, like how we have decided, we the grown-ups of this society have decided that like speed is more important than, this place that is caretaking all these little lives.
Right. That's a really fantastic point that it's not just a daycare. It is family after family after family that is essentially going to be displaced and have to find daycare. When really, my wife and I have even talked about this. There's a daycare that's closer by to where we live, but we don't want to remove our daughter from the friends and kinship and community that she's made, even if it, requires us to go another 10, 15 minutes further, because we just don't want to ruin that for her. So that's a fantastic point. There's another part that also hit home because there are a lot of discussions, and this is just so surface level of, well, if there's congestion, we got to add lanes. We got to add lanes. We got to add lanes. And they're doing it in Chicago right now. And my God, traffic is terrible. But regardless, what really gets me is you outlined, and activists that you spoke with outlined, how this is a complete facade. How adding lanes to a highway does not help and could actually hurt. So if you could you explain why this does not help at all?
Yeah, this was the other basic question I had when I started reporting this book, which is if adding lanes to a highway doesn't fix traffic, why do we keep doing this? Why do we spend billions and billions of dollars adding lanes to highways? And the basic reason that it doesn't work has been well understood since at least the 1930s, and it's because of a phenomenon called induced demand. So basically what it means is that when you add capacity to a highway, cars will just fill up that capacity. So travel is a good like any other good, and it operates according to the laws of supply and demand. So when you increase supply, often demand follows. You induce demand by adding lanes to a highway. People change their behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, someone might move farther from their job. They might take more discretionary trips. They might go to the grocery store 3 times a week or go to a happy hour they otherwise wouldn't go to. So people take more trips. This is measurable. It's been proven in city after city. And overall driving, even controlling for population increases. So when you add capacity, it does not solve congestion, as our state DOTs would like us to believe. It just means that more cars, more drivers, more driving will result. And again, that has been just repeated in city after city, decade after decade across the country, this basic law. An economist in the 1960s called it the fundamental law of road congestion. And yet it seems to escape the understanding of the engineers who run our state highway departments.
There's another egregious example that you gave, and it was Congressman John Culbertson, who said he took pride in expanding the highway to 22 lanes. First off, when I hear this, I'm like, holy shit, 22 lanes is insane. Through your analysis, drive times worsened. Is there a number that would ever work to say, oh yeah, this will lead to less congestion? Why not make it 30 lanes? Why not make it 40 lanes? Is there possibly any way of just, this is what we have to do and build more lanes in order to have less congestion and have drive times be lessened?
If there is a number, I have not seen it enacted. We're certainly trying our best to find that number. The Katy Freeway, the one that you just mentioned, is actually 26 lanes, including frontage roads. It is an absolutely massive road.
God.
But what happened is they built that highway and it went out to kind of raw, undeveloped prairie. And so what happened was developers built a lot of homes on that prairie, and people thought, oh, hey, there's this big highway that's going to get me back to my job in downtown Houston. Great, I can go buy a big house. No shade to the decision of any individual family, but there's a phrase that development follows roads. So you build a big road and people will move out farther from where they're going. So I'm sure there's a limit. I'm sure you could build a 100-lane highway and At some point it would actually allow for free flowing travel. But the question is like, how much land are we willing to turn over to cars?
Yes, a very good question at that. There was another one that really stuck out to me. In Dallas, there was a 2021 study that found 377 acres of land in the core of the ninth most populous city had been consumed by I-345 or depressed by its presence. That represented $9 billion on developmental land, $255 million in annual property tax revenue for Dallas. Removing the highway could create the capacity for 50,000 new jobs and 26,000 Houston units, the study found. I'm just curious, when you were writing your book and when you found these numbers through these studies, and then you brought it up to someone who opposed it and who said, no, we need more lanes, we need more highway, and you presented these factual anecdotes, what was their reaction?
It depended on the person. In Dallas, that highway, it's I-345 and it connects South Dallas to North Dallas. And Dallas is a segregated city. And so a lot of people who live in South Dallas, it's a, predominantly Black neighborhood. They drive north to get to work because that's where all the jobs are. And people in South Dallas were pretty skeptical of the idea of removing that highway that, how am I going to get to work? How am I going to get to where I need to go? And, the answer to that question is like, okay, well, we're going to use that money to build a really robust, solid, reliable transit system. But I think that people who are like, there is some justifiable skepticism of like, well, why haven't you done that already? Like you could have already done that. I don't know if I believe that just when you tear out this highway and make it harder for me to get to work, you're going to actually reinvest in affordable housing or transit. So I think that's one response that I think is sort of justifiable. I think the kind of less justifiable one or the less kind of understandable one to me is that what TxDOT's response is that, removing that highway and creating all this opportunity to build housing and businesses and economic development, well, that is going to cause cataclysmic traffic congestion. And that cost to the city is too high to bear. And in fact, actually, the evidence contradicts that. So, just as induced demand is a phenomenon, which is when you build more roads, more people drive, so is reduced demand. So in lots of cities across the country, when car capacity is removed, either because there's some act of God, an earthquake or a natural disaster that closes the highway, or construction closes it, people measurably drive less. Traffic kind of evaporates. That happened in San Francisco when the Embarcadero Freeway, there was a massive earthquake that shut that highway down. It damaged the highway. People couldn't drive on it. And drivers, driving reduced by something like, 80%, or not, excuse me, it reduced by about 20%, and transit ridership increased 15%. So like we can see examples of like people make different decisions. They do not just say like, hey, my Google map always took me this way, so I'm going to go that same way and just sit in whatever traffic will arise. Like people are rational consumers of travel. But I think a lot of the kind of planners, the traffic engineers think that people will just go on the same route. They will make all the same decisions. When in fact, they won't. That lots of evidence shows that they won't. When you remove capacity, people drive less. So I think people really get stuck on the traffic around that conversation when like what I really wanted to do with the book is like really try to pose the question of like, well, is traffic congestion the only thing we care about? Like, are you maybe willing to accept a 2 or 3 minute longer commute if like there's more interesting places to go? If there's an affordable apartment that you could live in or your sister could live in? If there's like more businesses downtown that you might walk to once you get there? Like, we have made fast car travel like the value above all other values. And like, that's the only thing we measure. There's nothing else that we measure when we look at these massive highway expansions. We only measure how fast are the cars going to go. If they're going to go faster, then here you can have $5 billion. And what I think that Dallas study shows is like, we could measure other things. We could measure property tax base. We could measure housing. There's lots of other ways to think about the economic success of an infrastructure project.
Absolutely. Ending on a good note, though, at least in this segment, you mentioned Rochester, and I was fascinated by this. So they built the inner loop, and decades later, with help from the Obama administration's Tiger Grant, it sank 18 feet below ground. One thing that has been advocated for in this book is highway removal, which seems... And look, this is my first dabble in understanding roads. I was like, huh? You're going to remove highways? How are you going to do it? And then reading on, it's like, oh, this actually makes sense. So what did you learn about Rochester? What is the history, and what have been the effects of highway removal in that town?
Yeah, so Rochester is just kind of a classic example of an American city that surrounded its downtown with a highway. Almost every American city did this, but they were one of the first to. So they built what's called the Inner Loop Highway in the 1950s. It was this sunken highway that circled their downtown, and it was very much sold as a way to kind of revitalize what was a struggling downtown. And it had the opposite effect. People got on that highway and they drove home to the suburbs and they didn't come back.
Hmm.
So, fast forward 50 years, 60 years, Rochester is a declining town. Population is declining. Downtown population is declining. And city leaders are really looking for a revitalization project. And someone floats the idea of like, hey, people don't drive on this inner loop as much as they used to, as much as it was designed for. Like, what if we just got rid of it? What if we use that land for something else? And so in 2017, the Obama administration gave the city of Rochester a grant to do just that. So they basically filled in this kind of moat circling downtown. They brought, it was a sunken highway, and they brought it up to grade and, filled in that land. And then suddenly the city of Rochester, had 8 or 10 acres of land to like do something with. And what they did is they parceled it off and sold it to developers who built affordable apartments on that land. And it's really remarkable to go to Rochester because they've done half of their inner loop, and they're currently in the process of doing the second half, the inner loop north. The first project was the inner loop east. And you can go and you can walk around their downtown and like go look at the inner loop north, which is still a sunken highway, still has cars on it. And then just walk like a couple blocks south, and you're in this like the neighborhoods are congruent. They just float into one another. There are people living on land that used to be a highway. There's 4-story apartment buildings. Most of them are rented to people earning below the median income. And I talk to people who live in those apartments, and like a lot of people already have forgotten that a highway was ever there. Like it's very easy to walk in that neighborhood and sort of forget that there was ever a highway. And that happened over 6 years, 8 years. Like, and what that showed me is like, it is very possible to reimagine and rebuild our cities. Like, we absolutely transformed them in the 1950s when we built all these highways. Like, we could take them down and build something different in their place. And, like, almost every city in America has a housing crisis. Like, we need more housing in most cities. And, like, where could we put it? Land is the largest constraining factor in most places. Well, let's look at all of the land that our cars occupy. Like, are we saying that cars are the highest value versus like housing units for people? And I think that's like what Rochester shows with lots of cities that have torn down highways is that that land is an incredibly valuable asset, and there's an opportunity cost to giving it to cars.
Here's my follow-up, and I know we touched on this moments ago, but is it lobbying that does this? What have you found for the main reason why some who are lawmakers will go against building affordable housing and will stick with the road scenario?
Lobbying is definitely one reason. I mean, there's a classic story of political corruption. Car companies give a lot of money to lawmakers. Oil companies give a lot of money to lawmakers, particularly in Texas. So, the contractors that build highways, they have an enormous and very muscular lobby that influences state lawmakers in particular. And a lot of these decisions happen at the state level. The federal government is essentially just the bank for highway building. State DOTs make these decisions, and state DOTs answer to state lawmakers. And indeed, in lots of states, lawmakers are handsomely donated by all these industries I just mentioned. So I think that is certainly part of it. But I think, like I said, until recently, like, even governors, for example, who had committed to ambitious climate goals were still widening highways, despite transportation being the country's largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. There seemed to be this sort of disconnect between like values and the values enacted by our transportation system. I think that is beginning to change. But in Republican-led states like Texas, a lot of Republican leaders, like we talked about at the beginning, like cars are prosperity. Cars create prosperity. Cars create economic development for these leaders. And so any project that would remove car capacity threatens economic development. That is still very much the narrative in a lot of places.
I'm glad you brought up the climate because that was another big part. And obviously, we are living through a climate crisis where a lot of people just like to go on, business is normal, everything's fine, let me go get a gas guzzler, whatever. It's either this like, hey, we're totally F, so I'm just going to enjoy it, or I don't even think people at the top are going to do anything. So there's some wild numbers that I saw in your book. In 2018, excuse me, the last time the Texas Department of Transportation did an analysis of the greenhouse gases generated on its roads, it found that on-road emissions in Texas account for nearly half a percentage of total worldwide carbon dioxide emissions, more than some whole countries. Insane. Although the Texas Department of Transportation's analysis, according to it, the induced travel generated by expanding I-35 through central Houston would add nearly 500,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions by 2050. There was another one where we touched on it previously, but although the Biden administration committed to sustainability and equity, most of the transportation money on the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act would be spent, as it always has been, as you write, enabling seamless car travel. And they wanted this to be the EV model. But as you offer and tell us, EVs can be fine, but it's a false promise that we can all keep driving as much as we want and still reduce carbon emissions. How is building highways, and we know at this point about the model of cars in this country and what they do, but how is this, if you could paint the picture once more, just so detrimental to the climate?
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't really connect transportation as a climate story, but starting in about 2015, passenger cars and trucks became the leading contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in the US. So the transportation sector contributes more than a third of greenhouse gas emissions in the US, and most of that comes from passenger cars and trucks. So the cars that you and I drive around to do all of our daily business. Um, and that is because, we've built these cities around car travel, and people are driving more. So in most cities, emissions are increasing not just because there are more cars on the road, but because each one of those cars is going more miles. The affordable housing crisis has contributed to that as people move farther from their jobs to find housing they can afford. In a lot of cities, I sort of got into transportation as I was covering housing and zoning. In a lot of cities, land use policies make it very hard to build dense housing, which supports transit and walkability. And so because of land use, because of zoning, people have to drive quite far to be able to afford a home. And all of that contributes to increased greenhouse gas emissions. So every one of these highway expansions I talk about in my book, every one that's happening across the country will measurably increase greenhouse gas emissions. And I think a lot of leaders think that, well, we're going to get a bunch of EVs on the road, and that's going to mean that it doesn't matter. Like, you don't need to worry about it because the EVs are coming. But they're not coming fast enough. And the energy that powers them in a lot of places is not clean enough.
Right.
So if our grid was entirely renewable and everyone drove an EV, it would be a very different conversation right now. But I think the last I looked, something like 8% of cars on the road are electric vehicles. That is unlikely to change under the Trump administration. So that means still 92% of the cars on these highways are polluting with greenhouse gas emissions. And that means that the air quality will only get worse. Our cities will only get hotter, drier. It only will exacerbate climate change. And I think some people are starting to make the connection between transportation and climate change. Certainly some youth activists who I talk about in the book. There's this group in Portland these young people, part of the Sunrise Movement, who protested outside of the Oregon Department of Transportation headquarters against a highway expansion. And they held signs that said, climate leaders don't widen freeways. And I think that message is so new. Like a lot of people, like I said, a lot of people, climate leaders, quote unquote, were still pursuing highway expansions, not realizing that those very much increase greenhouse gas emissions. And the quickest and most efficient way to reduce transportation related greenhouse gas emissions is to get people in transit. And some states are doing that. I actually wrote a story for the New York Times about the state of Colorado. Their governor passed a law requiring all state agencies to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by 90% by 2050. And the Colorado Department of Transportation looked at their portfolio of projects, which included expanding I-25 through the middle of Denver. And they said, hey, we actually can't do this highway expansion and meet our now state mandated greenhouse gas targets. So we're going to take that highway expansion off the table. We're not going to do it. And instead, we're going to spend that money building bus rapid transit throughout Denver. I think that is like a very hopeful story, is that when you make transportation climate driven, when you force leaders to take climate into consideration when they make transportation decisions, that can accelerate the transition to better transit.
Quick follow up. You said 2050. Isn't that even stretching it? Like, shouldn't we try to get there as soon as possible?
Well, yeah, yeah, yes, obviously.
Yeah. I
And
mean,
like I think that like yes, we need to get there tomorrow. And like
yeah,
every that's what is like the cumulative amount of emissions matters. So like even if we get to 100% electric vehicles by 2050, like that is likely too late. And so every highway expansion, like it's not just, I think the thing that that drove me nuts kind of reporting this, it's not just that we are maintaining the status quo, which is a hard enough problem. Lots of people drive. We need to figure out how to make those trips cleaner. We are actually about on track to spend $500 billion as a country making the problem worse by expanding these highways. Like, that is the problem. We need to stop that, making it worse, and then we can talk about how to make it better.
right. God, that's a crazy number. There was one part that drove me crazy only because, being in media, we know how this game works with philanthropy. You cited a 2021 study that found that less than 4% of philanthropic funding dedicated to fighting climate change went to transportation, despite its representing a third of US greenhouse gas emissions. Was this another part where you just wanted to yank your hair out?
Yeah, because it seemed to me so obvious that
Yeah,
transportation is a climate story. It just seemed so patently obvious. And yet, like I said, it was sort of surprising to me to learn that like lots of people don't see it that way. Not that they disagree, they just sort of haven't thought about it. And a lot of sort of philanthropic money has gone to the EV transition, not to trying to build more walkable, transit-oriented cities. Um, and I think that just speaks to like how entrenched car culture is, like how hard it is to get people to think about building differently.
yeah. You mentioned the Texas Department of Transportation. Um, God, I mean, the stories that we saw in your book were just villainous at points, and full of deceit as well. At one point, they said adding lanes to I-35 would increase greenhouse gas emissions only fractionally. The Rocky Mountain Institute would disagree. They would call it a small coal-fired power plant. So are they just professional liars, just trying to carry out the good deeds per se? And I'm being sarcastic there. The good deeds of highway expansion.
I don't know if I would go so far as to call them liars. I mean, they are using data to justify the project that they want to build. Um, so projecting greenhouse gas emissions, there's certainly a margin of error there. But I think that like the conclusion is foregone. They are just justifying how they get there. My actual favorite example, which is also in the book, is so a lot of these studies that when you do a highway expansion, you have to do an environmental analysis. So you have to sort of justify why the project is needed. And so in the I-35 project, I-35 spans about 8 miles through central Austin. And currently, driving 8 miles in rush hour takes about 20 minutes. But if we don't expand this highway, this is according to TxDOT, by 2030, it's going to take like 45 minutes. And then by 2050, it's going to take 227 minutes on this highway to travel 8 miles. 227 minutes is like more than 3 hours to travel 8 miles. Like most people, including myself, can walk 8 miles in less than 3 hours. And yet they use that as scientific fact, saying the cataclysmic traffic congestion that is going to paralyze Austin, like we must do something about it. But it is like if you just even use common sense for 10 minutes, you realize that like no one is going to sit in traffic for 227 minutes to travel 8 miles. They simply will not take that trip. And TxDOT's models like do not account for that. They don't account for how people change their behavior faced with changing conditions. And so it's not that it's like, as a journalist, it's hard for me to say lying, but like they are using the assumptions embedded in that data are getting the outcome they want.
Mm,
when you even common sense mean, you look at that and you see that's just not possible.
right. In Houston, this is another thing that I truly believe we don't think about. We don't think about climate change when it comes to cars, at least not as much as we should. And then also the health benefits of us as a society. You mentioned how students in the Houston area would suffer from asthma at twice the rate. So this is huge. And when you talk about how, Texas is Republican led, right? And one of the main things that we always hear in campaigns is how pro-life they are. But yet, if we are seeing the dire effects of cars, especially on students who are just vulnerable young kids trying to learn, suffering from asthma, why is this just completely being ignored?
That's a great question. I mean, that the right to life thing is a little hard for me to answer, for lots of reasons. I mean, another same version of that question is like 40,000 people die every year in traffic crashes. Like, why are we ignoring that? Um, Driving is actually incredibly dangerous. Like, not to mention the like downstream effects of air pollution, which kill tens of thousands of people every year. Asthma causes early deaths measurably every single year. But not just that, but like the number of people that die driving, that die in their cars, that die as pedestrians when they are struck by cars. Like it's a horrific number. And that is just sort of counted. I don't know, like that is something that is really hard for me to kind of like, how do we just accept that?
Right.
How do we accept that this is just the cost of getting where we want to go when there are other options available to us? Like there are much safer ways to get around, and mostly that's in a bus or on a train. And yet we keep building these cities, and like a lot of these highways expansions are justified through safety. But like the data shows they actually don't get safer. People continue to die as they drive more.
Right.
So I don't know how to answer the air pollution one except to say like we seem to ignore the cost, the human cost to these highways in multiple ways.
I know you mentioned a few towns. I believe you said Copenhagen was a model. Is there one in the United States that if someone is listening to this and they're still feeling like, nah, can't happen, is there one town or a few towns in the United States that could serve as that example?
I mean, the cities in the US that have the best transit, as you know, like sort of boomed before the 1950s, before we spent a lot of money building interstate highways. So, I think like New York is a great example of a city that has come up around transit and, has values accordingly. You can walk around that city, you can take transit. Um, I think what I find really interesting are cities like Austin, like Denver, like Los Angeles that are really trying to retrofit themselves to be less sprawling and less car centric. So Denver is one that like I'm watching. It's not happening. It has not happened yet. But like what I mentioned with the Colorado Department of Transportation, that the state and the city are really working in lockstep to incentivize more dense housing, to incentivize more transit. So I think that's a city that could like really transform over the coming decades. Um, I also like, a lot of cities, a dozen cities have taken out highways. This is not like a one-off to Rochester. San Francisco removed a highway. Portland, booming Portland, removed a stretch of highway right in its downtown. Milwaukee removed a stretch of highway and built the new Milwaukee Bucks Stadium on that land that used to be a highway. So there are like kind of unusual, unexpected examples throughout the US of cities like Rochester who realized like, hey, our city is declining, let's revitalize it. And the first thing that they sought to do was remove a highway.
Right. You also wrote of one couple who could not afford a home, got priced out of buying a home in a suburb just south of Austin. Then they would move into a red brick house, but the commute really affected one of them. So, how does highways and long commutes bring out sometimes the absolute worst in us?
Yeah, I mean, anyone who's sat in a commute for 30 or 45 minutes or an hour, like, sort of knows intuitively the answer to that question. Like, it is very maddening to be stuck in traffic. And certainly understand the impulse of commuters who say, hey, why don't we make this highway bigger so I can get home quicker? But what that does is just only make kind of entrench the form of commuting that drives people crazy. But this one person named Angel Leverett, yeah, she moved to a suburb south of Austin where she and her husband could afford a place to live. And she started commuting, an hour one way to get to her job. And she found that like it really impacted her mood. She would get home really irritable. She also said something that stuck with me that she really lived for the weekends. Her
Mm,
weekdays were basically like commuting, get home, have dinner with her husband, go to bed. Like there was just no space to see her friends, to work out, to do any of the other things that we might want to do with our days, that it was just really commuting. Um, and the other like very small detail, I actually did her commute with her. I was just like, hey, I'm going to drive down to your house one morning and do your commute with you. And she told me traffic on I-35 is very stop and go, but she had this like Achilles injury in her heel because her foot is just like hovering over the gas and brake every day for 2 hours. And for whatever reason, that just like stuck with me is just this tiny little injury of all the harms that are created by our highways. It's just like just the costs are just like we don't even know. We're not even tallying them up. And she just like I talked to her about like, well, what could make your commute better? TxDOT is planning to expand this highway. Like, do you support that? And it hadn't occurred to her that like TxDOT could maybe build a train instead. And once I floated that possibility, she's like, "Oh yeah, I want that." But it hadn't occurred to her that that was a possibility. I mean, because it's not. TxDOT has not offered that as a possibility, but like our political leaders could make it one. But I think it's just remarkable of like once you are stuck commuting in a car, it's kind of hard to imagine anything else.
definitely. There's also another angle to all of this, which is the pure fear tactics that we have seen from some. You wrote of David Ditch, who's a research associate at the Heritage Foundation. He said users of highways and airports directly cover most of the cost of highway and airport infrastructure. In contrast, transit users cover less than a third of the cost of transit systems, which receive a variety of subsidies. As such, the mass transit account represents a long-standing wealth transfer from people who drive to people who don't. He believes, this is a big one that we talked about previously. He believes subsidized transit is socialism. And off of the Heritage Foundation's own website, Project 2025 will stop socialism in its tracks. So we certainly do have a theme here. But it's also being met. And you spoke with Beth Osborne, who is the director of the nonprofit Transportation for America, former assistant secretary for transportation policy at the U.S. Department of Transportation. Starting with the Heritage Foundation, how has their messaging won over the public, if it has?
Yeah, I mean, that's what we talked about earlier is there is this message that highways are free or enable free markets and transit is subsidized socialism. But like when you follow the money, when you actually look at our highway trust fund and the dollars that flow into that, you realize that's not true. What he said, David Ditch said, is actually false. You can look it up. Since 2008, the Highway Trust Fund became insolvent and general revenue, which means the tax you and I pay on our income and various other things goes to support the Highway Trust Fund. And so people who don't drive at all are actually also paying for our roads. Um, so like I don't know how it has won out. I don't know how it's persisted so strongly, but like, there is like when you get on a bus, right, you pay a fare.
Right.
When you get on the road, you don't pay for it, right? And so it feels free. But it's not, our tax dollars pay for those roads to an exorbitant amount.
From what you've seen with Beth Osborne and others, what has been the best methodology for activists to fight what they feel are inhumane policies that are stunting the growth of community?
I think it really depends on like what level of government you're fighting. I mean, I think Beth Osborne has been incredibly effective. Like I've learned so much from her, talking to her like at the federal government, getting, people who are working on transportation at Congress to understand that the money that they're spending is not actually providing them the outcomes that they want. So I think like having a little more accountability, which, falls to journalists, it falls to lots of people, but like uh a state DOT promises to widen a highway to fix congestion. Like nobody bothers to go back 5 years later to be like, did they fix congestion? Did they make your commute easier? And then oftentimes the answer is no, but like you don't see that headline in local newspapers. You don't see congressional delegations talking about that. Um, I think on the very like grassroots level, on the local level, this group in Houston called Stop Textile I-45 did a really remarkable job of like mobilizing public opposition to this massive expansion. And they did that largely by going door to door in neighborhoods impacted by the expansion. So, this footprint of this highway expansion goes across 28 miles. It will displace 1,200 people, 1,200 homes, households. And then a lot of the neighborhoods right adjacent to the highway, people had no idea. They had missed a letter from TxDOT. They didn't speak English, perhaps. They were renters and their landlord hadn't told them. And so what they did is they spent, months going door to door in every one of these neighborhoods saying, hey, do you know about this expansion? Do you know that it's coming? Do you know what it'll do to your neighborhood? And really sort of galvanized a kind of very grassroots opposition that started showing up to city council, to the Metropolitan Planning Organization, getting very like normal people are often excluded from these transportation decisions, participating in the process. They organized demonstrations, they got the mayor involved. And I think that that was really inspiring to me to see because these transportation decisions often they're so slow, they're so bureaucratic, they're so wonky. And I think what was very cool to see is like people sort of protesting on the street saying, hey, we don't want more cars. We don't want more violence. We want buses. We want bikes. And like making it much more tangible and real for people.
Definitely. There was one other number that I saw, and again, I'm just thinking about this, excuse me, as a Chicagoan, that I'm on the L, and this read in your book, 9 out of 10 cars are occupied by a single person. Jarring, like totally jarring. And I'm just thinking about, as I'm on the train, how is this sustainable? So I'm in a train car, right? And I'm just thinking about like, okay, so that person has a car. So that person has a car. And there's a good, I don't know, 30 people probably in that train car. So I'm just visualizing like, how is this possibly going to play out in the long run? I understand we all have places to go, but there just needs to be better ways of doing this than having cars that have one person, and then especially with the effects of climate change that we had, that we discussed as well. So it's just, that one really stuck out to me. Like, wow, we are just so wasteful. We're designed to be wasteful. We're designed to clog up space, get from point A to point B, sit in traffic for hours, and then just go back home and do the same thing. There was another question in council that you mentioned. In terms of the pushback against removing I-345, talking about making it easier for people to go through the community, why is the conversation not around creating places to bring people to our community instead? That one really stuck out to me because they're intertwined. It's a long highway with so many people, and yet we're not thinking about how we could be more inclusive. Have you possibly seen a pendulum shift since that question came up in city council?
No, is the honest answer. I think, leaders are really trying to have that discussion around building like vibrant places, walkable places. A lot of that stuff is kind of buzzy now, particularly in the kind of housing movement. So I think it's being talked about, like the idea of we want to build like places, like not just like a downtown, but like neighborhoods that have a mix of businesses that people can walk to a supermarket or to a school that they take their kids to, that they do not have to drive everywhere they need to go. I think that is sort of percolating. I don't know that like has necessarily hit the mainstream yet, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Well, I really appreciate your time. I just have to ask, Megan, as we end our discussion, what is your last message to someone who may have learned a thing or two, but have also taken an interest in how highways really can affect our lives negatively? What would be your last message to them?
Yeah, I think it's just like realizing that these structures are not inevitable. I have only ever lived in a city completely wrapped by highways. Like I've never lived more than 5 miles from a highway. You go outside your door and they just feel like they have always been there and they will always be there. That this is just this immutable feature of our urban landscape. And I think what reporting this book did for me is like it helped me see these differently, these giant structures that just contour our cities and disconnect us. Like those are a policy choice. These highways are a policy decision that we made and continue to make, and we can make different decisions and build different kinds of cities.
Amen to that. Megan Kimble. The book is City Limits, Infrastructure, Inequality, and the Future of America's Highways. There it is right there. Megan, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. I appreciate your journalism. I appreciate you going into these communities, telling these stories, because these are American stories, and these are stories that matter. So thank you so much for your work. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. This is fun.
Want to say thank you again to Megan Kimble for her time. And if you'd like to purchase City Limits, a link is in the description box below. As always, I appreciate all of you watching and listening. Have a great day.